Now it is time to discuss this week's big stories. Joining me is Ebony Bennett from the Australia Institute and Kian Hussey from the Institute of Public Affairs. Good afternoon to you both. Great to see you. Thank you for joining me. Let's get straight into it. We'll start with the federal budget. Ebony, what did you take from the budget?
I think it's really encouraging to see that the government has abandoned the rhetoric around debt and deficit of the last 20 years and really embraced public spending. After all, that I think is what has buoyed the Australian economy through the crisis. It's absolutely the right thing to do during an economic crisis. However, I think it's really concerning to see how poorly targeted some of that spending is. We've got huge public subsidies for fossil fuels in here and virtually nothing to reduce emissions. On aged care reform, there's a lot of funding for aged care, but not so much on the reform side of things. You've got only one-sixth of the funding that the Royal Commission recommended. And again, that's not really, much like JobKeeper, tied to many obligations for providers when it comes to wage increases or better nutrition and those kinds of things. And lastly, we've got temporary tax cuts for low and middle income earners, but permanent tax cuts coming down the line for high income earners. It's going to cost the budget $18 billion a year, and about 3/4 of that is going to go to the top 20% of income earners. So, as I said, encouraging to see public spending, but some of that is very poorly targeted. For example, those tax cuts were legislated way before we had the current economic crisis. They might look a lot different if we were legislating for them now.
Yeah, the tax cuts certainly are one of the big takeaways from the budget. Kian, what did you make of the budget? Do you think that it struck the right note?
Well, my biggest concern with this budget is, contrary to Ebony, is the debt and deficits. IPA research that we released earlier this year warned that the argument that our record level of debt, which is going to hit $1 trillion or 50% of GDP, the arguments that this doesn't matter because interest rates are low are dangerous and dishonest. So in our IPA report we released earlier this year, we warned that interest rates were going to rise. And by 2030, we could be spending up to $64 billion a year on the interest cost alone. What we've seen between October and May, the cost of government debt has doubled. The interest rate that the Commonwealth Government is paying has doubled. It's exactly as we warned. And what we know is that in the future, this is going to cost Australian taxpayers through higher taxes, but it also means we're hamstringing ourselves. We're not going to be able to respond to future crises because the debt situation is going to be so much worse. And we're just pushing this cost onto future generations of Australians, which I think is quite immoral because they're the ones who don't actually have a say in the spending that we're doing today. So the debt and deficits still matter, and it was quite disappointing that the government hasn't outlined a plan to return to surplus and to really start considering this massive amount of debt that we have.
Yeah, a sea of red, as it has been described by some. One of the big shocks to many within the tourism industry was an assumption that international travel is not likely to resume until mid-next year. Ebony, what sort of an impact do you think that might have, that we could be waiting a year or more until the international border is reopened?
Look, I think that's a huge concern for the economy. So much of the Australian economy relies on migrant workers. A lot of our education exports rely on international students, and the rest of the world is beginning to open up. And I think it's really concerning that our vaccine rollout is so far behind, but also that we haven't taken the last year to kind of build the resilience that we need, to build the quarantine facilities that we need to last us for the long term when we know this virus isn't going anywhere. So again, I think you can see this reflected in the budget. There is spending, which is encouraging. That's what's buoying the economy, but it's poorly targeted. There's not a lot in here that will deliver lasting benefits. And if you're in the tourism industry or indeed in the arts sector, places that were earliest hit and are likely to be the last to recover, this will be incredibly discouraging, to say the least, for a university sector that was left out of JobKeeper and now can't rely on international students coming back. There's a real failure to plan for the long term here.
Well, there is JobKeeper gone now. Kian, do you think that Qantas and Virgin should get extra financial support for the impact to that delay in reopening the border?
Well, I think all of this at the end of the day comes down to Australia's absurd elimination strategy. We've been talking about this for the past 15 months, but it's not possible to eliminate the virus. It's this fantasy strategy where we'll completely eradicate coronavirus and then protect ourselves from it. What we've seen is that that is not possible. We're going to have outbreaks here and there.
Is it an elimination strategy, though? The federal government's saying that's not what they're pursuing.
Well, I think actions speak louder than words. We cut off flights and introduced, jail time and fines for people trying to come in, for Australians trying to return home to Australia from India. The international border closure, of course, has been probably the most important response from the federal government. But the state governments, we have one case in Perth and then a lockdown. We have one case in Sydney and measures are reintroduced. We have one case or two cases in Melbourne and measures are introduced. It is an elimination strategy, and it doesn't actually matter what the premiers and the Prime Minister say when they claim that it's not an elimination strategy. The fact of the matter is that it is an elimination strategy, and until we're willing to deal with the virus in a risk-based, proportionate way, then these kinds of there's always going to be calls for support for the tourism sector and airlines, but at the end of the day, we need to learn to live with the virus. It's been around for more than a year. We know how to respond to outbreaks when they occur. And unless we're willing to do that, we're just going to have to deal with these border closures and calls for more support.
Let's look at Anthony Albanese's budget reply speech now, Ebony. There's been some suggestions it was more of an election pitch, a campaign speech of sorts, than a budget reply. Do you agree?
Actually, I thought that they were probably leaving some powder dry for the election. I thought there were some good announcements in there. But big picture, I think the federal budget was really a vindication of Labor's approach during the global financial crisis, that when the economy is in crisis, it is important for the public sector to step in and spend big. So I think on that hand, while it's a vindication, it does make it a very difficult budget reply for Labor. But I did think there were some really good things in there. We had the energy apprenticeships. I think that shows you that Labor will be trying to make the argument that that climate action is going to be good for jobs. I think we'll be seeing a lot more around housing affordability. And I think, their pitch of actually building social housing compared to trying to saddle single parents with a massive mortgage and only a very small deposit is probably a better approach and much more appealing for many low-income earners. But in the long term, I think we'll probably see a lot more details as we get closer to the election. And I do think it is important to acknowledge it probably is a difficult budget for Labor to respond to, because, there's not a lot of points in saying, I told you so. And so much of this budget was a vindication of Labor's approach and really shows that the coalition, when it argued about debt and deficit and public spending, it really was just political. It was nothing really to do with the economics. The Reserve Bank has been very comfortable with the level of public spending. It would like to see more on wage increases. I think that'll be another thing that we see Labor pursue as we head to the election. The fact that while they're delivering permanent tax cuts for high income earners, for ordinary workers, wage growth has been low for so long, at record lows, and there's really nothing in this budget to help boost that. I think you'll hear a lot more from Labor on that down the track.
Yeah, you mentioned social housing, Kian. That seemed to be really the centrepiece of the budget reply speech. What are your thoughts on it?
Well, I think your assessment is right. And that was, although I dislike the federal budget, part of the political genius of it is that Scott Morrison has covered the aged care and childcare issues, which Labor were working up to criticising the government on. The social housing issue, though, I don't think we're going to fix this problem of home ownership and unaffordable housing through the creation of a fund that will build some houses. Home ownership is a central pillar of the Australian way of life. And at the moment, we're risking creating a generation of people, particularly these younger people who aren't able to get on the property ladder. And that's going to be very dangerous for our future as a country. We know, though, that the RBA, the Reserve Bank, their monetary policy is driving this issue of making housing less affordable. The RBA's own research has outlined that the current monetary policy settings are favouring the wealthy and the already established, and they're disenfranchising poorer, lower income Australians who can't get onto the property ladder. Monetary policy is one of the reasons, because it increases at least the asset price inflation. Then we have other issues such as red tape, which drives up the cost of creating housing. And I think that those are the kind of structural issues that we do need to address. It's very important that the government works to make housing more affordable for Australians, and I'm not sure that this creating a few tens of thousands of social houses is going to be enough to fix that problem.
Well, it seems, though, despite all this, we are probably almost heading into an election mode, as both the budget and the budget reply suggests. Ebony Bennett, Kian Hussey, we have to leave it there. Thank you. Hussey, we have to leave it there. Thank you to both of you for joining me.
The bottom 20% get nothing. They're really unfair tax cuts.
People want to see much stronger action from the government when it comes to climate change.
It's no coincidence that we have a wages crisis in Australia.
Transitioning to net zero emissions, it doesn't seem like there's much room for gas.